Another geopolitical power play that's been going on between India, China and Pakistan, even as the Modi government is adopting a more visibly assertive foreign policy, particularly when it comes to China, to try and counter its expansionist designs. The latest flashpoint emerged when External Affairs Minister S Jaishankar backed the right of the Philippines to its territorial sovereignty. He's on a visit to Southeast Asia. Remember, the Philippines has been stuck in a dispute with China over the South China Sea. The Xi Jinping regime has said that maritime disputes between countries concerned and any third party is not in a position to interfere. Of course, that was a reference to India. It comes at a time when China's diplomatic expansion is going on almost unchecked in the Maldives, in Sri Lanka and Nepal, even as China continues to claim all of Arunachal Pradesh as its own territory. At times, even saber-rattling at the line of actual control, where a resolution has been not forthcoming for the better part of the last 4 years since the Galwan incident. Given the proximity of China's strategic interests with Pakistan, is it time for India to junk its age-old approach of balanced diplomacy? Is it time for India to also reject the One China policy?
Every country has an interest in maritime security, in maritime safety. Every country has the right to uphold and enforce its national sovereignty.
All right, just let's run you through how India seems to have taken a more assertive approach when it comes to countering China. When China flexed and protested against the Prime Minister's visit to Arunachal Pradesh, he was there a few weeks ago to inaugurate the Sela Tunnel, which is the world's highest altitude tunnel. China at that time had called the boundary dispute an unresolved matter. India's counter to that was that Arunachal was, is and always will be an integral part of India. China had flexed back at that time with military operations, expanding military operations near the line of actual control. India countered that back in January of this year, with the centre launching as many as 35 projects to boost connectivity at the line of actual control. China said that it did not recognize what was illegally constituted as the Union Territory of Ladakh. India's counter to that was that China has no right to interfere in what is clearly India's internal matters. China went on to say that it has released maps claiming the entire South China Sea, the 9-dash line as they call it. And even though India does not have a direct stake in the South China Sea, you heard from the External Affairs Minister while he was in the Philippines a day or so ago. India has countered that by saying that it defends the Philippines and every other nation's right to defend its territorial integrity. China has said that it's forging defense ties with the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Nepal. India is countering that by batting for cooperation in the Quad countries to bolster maritime security. Brahma Chalani, strategic affairs expert, and Andrew K.P. Leung is independent China strategist. Both of them are joining us now. Brahma Chalani, there is a school of argument, if you will, that what happens with the Philippines or what happens with Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc., their problems, their bilateral problems with China is something that India should stay away from, because after all, it is the internal affairs of another country. Why should India get involved? The External Affairs Minister in the Philippines saying that every country has the right to defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty, and China seems to have taken grave offense to that. How does India play this? Because India's got its own set of problems with China. The last thing India wants is third countries to interfere in that. Shouldn't the same principle apply to China's disputes with other countries?
China's disputes with neighboring countries are interlinked. For example, South China Sea. Whatever happens in the South China Sea directly impinges on India's economic, energy, and strategic interests. or for that matter, whatever happens in the Taiwan Strait, will impinge on India's security. For example, hypothetically, if mainland China were to forcibly absorb Taiwan, then its focus would turn to India, to Arunachal Pradesh, in the name of reunification. Therefore, both Taiwan issue as well as the South China issue are linked to Indian interests, and India cannot be a bystander without having any view on the developments there, because these developments that we are witnessing in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait are an open violation of international law. An international tribunal at The Hague very clearly invalidated China's claims in the South China Sea. And yet, what China has done is to heap scorn on that tribunal's ruling and extend its expansionism in the South China Sea. So this is an issue also for international security.
Andrew K.P. Leung, there was an UNCLOS verdict. This was a verdict by a United Nations recognized court back in 2016, which ruled in favor of the Philippines. China did not recognize that verdict. China did not implement that verdict. In fact, for the last year or so, since the new regime of Mr. Bongbong Marcos has come into power in the Philippines, every week we are seeing an incident between Chinese vessels and Philippine vessels. Why shouldn't India stand with a country? And what did the foreign minister of India say after all? He just said that every country has the right to defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty. China would believe in that principle. That's what China is elucidating when it comes to Israel and Gaza. That's what China is elucidating when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. So why should that principle, when the Indian foreign minister says it in the context of Philippines, be so touchy for China?
I think that there is a danger of mixing various scenarios or putting all in one single basket. In fact, for example, the situation in Taiwan is very different because according to international law recognized by the United Nations, Taiwan is not a country, and Taiwan is recognized as part of China because China is the recognized country representing the whole nation, including Taiwan.
But Philippines is a country, and the UNCLOS verdict ruled in favor of the Philippines as far as Scarborough Shoal is concerned. So how come you're not recognizing that?
Well, that's why I'm saying you can't mix Taiwan with the other situations. Now, as far as the Philippines are concerned, and of course the China's relationship with India, there are lots of border disputes. Both sides do not recognize each other's claims. The same situation applies to the situation in around the Philippines, because China has already consistently maintained its claims in the so-called 9-dash lines.
Do you know the first time the reference to 9-dash line was made, even in Chinese literature, was after the year 2000. There was no concept of 9-dash line. And why should the rest of the world accept the concept of the 9-dash line? It's like tomorrow you can come and draw a line anywhere and say, this is the boundary between India and China. Why should the rest of the world accept that?
Well, that was not arbitrarily drawn all of a sudden. It goes back all the way to even before the change of power in China, under the Kuomintang, and also the China's sovereignty and governance over
Can
that territory.
you show any historical paper or document, Mr. Leung, which shows that the Philippines, which is modern-day Philippines, was ever under any Chinese kingdom?
Well, we are not talking about the whole of the Philippines, for heaven's sake. Of course, Philippines is a separate country. We're talking about some islands out there.
The problem is one of convenience. China thinks that because it's the preeminent power in this part of the world, it can ride roughshod over smaller countries. And by the way, it's not just one. It's not just the Philippines. It is Japan, it is South Korea, it is Vietnam, it is Indonesia, it is Malaysia. I can go on and on and on. Each one, and I'm not even talking about Taiwan, forget about Taiwan, all right? Excluding Taiwan, all of these countries have a problem with China. It's China that is creating the issue with all of these countries. Because it's revising history. It's coming up with, in 1895, we controlled the Senkaku Islands before the war with Japan. We had this 9-dash line and therefore Scarborough Shoal belongs to us. I mean, we're living in the 21st century. Why are you going back to 1895 and to the 9-dash line? You're revising history.
Well, I think again you're mixing up the Senkaku Islands again, because if you talk about the Senkaku Islands, you've got to go back at the end of the Second World War, and then at the end of the Second World War, it was recognized by the United Nations, by all the powers, that Japan should have handed back the island to China, but in fact, that was not the case. It was given to Japan again for administration. So let's not mix up all the other.
Okay, so what happened between 1895 and 1945? That's conveniently forgotten. The fact that Japan occupied those islands in those years, that's again conveniently forgotten. But anyway, be that as it may, let me go back to Brahmachalani. I think there is a larger point, which perhaps is a lesson for India as well, that the only way India or any other country in this part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific, can take on China in a way to remind China that there are rules, there is a rules-based order and China can't ride roughshod over it with or without the United States. Let's leave the United States alone for a moment. All of these countries that I mentioned have to come together with India to enforce the rules that the world function by. And that is that you don't just walk over another person's territory or claim another person's territory suddenly because you think you are the preeminent economic and military power in this part of the world.
You're absolutely right, Zaka. That's the reason why India has stood up to China for 4 years now. India has been locked in a military standoff with China following Chinese encroachments in Ladakh. And that is also the reason why small countries like the Philippines and Vietnam are standing up for their territorial and strategic interests vis-a-vis China. But I think it's important to keep in mind one important thing, which is that in international law, a territorial claim must be based on lasting and peaceful exercise of sovereignty over the entire territory concerned. Now, you take China's territorial claims over its neighbors. None of these claims meets the standard set out in international law. It is telling that these territorial claims from the East and South China Seas to the Taiwan Strait and the Himalayas are based not on international law, but on revisionist history rewritten by the Communist Party of China. China's weak legal case was highlighted by the Hague ruling of 2016, when an international arbitral tribunal unanimously rejected Chinese claims in the South China Sea. And the problem is that China's manipulation of history extends beyond advancing territorial claims. It often uses history to instill among the Chinese an abiding sense of nationalism, an abiding sense of grievance over the 110 years of national humiliation that China suffered after the communist takeover in Beijing. So it's all about revisionism, revisionist history, and which is now taking the form of covert territorial revisionism, like in the Himalayas, in the South China Sea. Without firing a single shot, China has redrawn the map of the South China Sea and is seeking to replicate the South China Sea model in the Himalayas by encroaching on the territory of even tiny Bhutan.
Okay, Mr. Leong, I'll give you the final word. I'd just like to add to what Professor Chalani was saying. It's also linked in a way Of course, much of this is also for domestic consumption in China because it rallies the nation, the nationalistic sentiment, so on and so forth. But at the same time, this is also directly proportional to how bad the Chinese economy is doing. If the Chinese economy were in a better place than what it is today, there wouldn't be the need for all this rhetoric. There wouldn't be the need for every week some Chinese vessel ramming into a Filipino vessel or some Chinese jets crossing the median zone with Taiwan. There wouldn't be this need if China's economy was growing at 7, 8, 10%.
Just think about China's economy is only going downwards only after the pandemics. And if you look at what the China's economy was doing before the pandemics, it was doing extremely well. And then even at that time, China had been exerting its territorial integrity throughout the region. What's happening over the
Who is
South
to
China
blame
Sea,
for the pandemic?
Taiwan,
Is America to blame for the pandemic?
Even before,
may I remind you where it
China's
started
economy
from?
is turning downhill.
Mr. Liang, who
So
is to blame for the pandemic?
With the Chinese economy, I think it's nonsense.
No, who is to blame for the pandemic? If you're saying, yes, the Chinese economy has crashed after the pandemic, yes, that's factually correct. But where did the pandemic come from? It didn't come from Washington, it came from Wuhan.
Well, again, you're making outrageous claims.
Outrageous claims?
I think that
the first case of COVID-19 did not come from Wuhan. Is that your contention?
I mean, it sort of it originated from Wuhan. And you look at the pandemics. A lot of pandemics originated in other countries.
Okay.
Some in the United States.
Okay,
we'll
leave it at that. At least I'm glad you accepted that it did originate from Wuhan. We'll leave it at that. Thank you very much to Andrew Liang and to Professor Chalani. But we'll see how this plays out, and I suspect in the third term of the Modi government, as and when, and if and when they come to power, I think the dynamic with China will certainly change, because you will see a lot more of this rhetoric, this public posturing, shadow boxing, if you will. And I guess you will also see, from India's point of view, a lot more cooperation with countries in Southeast Asia, because they are also at the receiving end of this Chinese aggression and Chinese revisionism, if you will.